Good morning, one and all. Welcome to Bhavishya IAS Academy. Today, we will be discussing what are the potential factors behind the US action against Venezuela and what are the implications and what is the pretext that US has usurped the territory of Venezuela. So, is the sovereignty of the global south is endangering? So these are some of the issues that we will be discussing. So, starting the recent US Operation Absolute resulting in the arrest of Venezuelan president that we have seen. It has revived serious debates over the prohibition on the use of force in international law. Although Washington, it said that, see, the action is just a law enforcement. Although it involved the use of military force on sovereign territory without UN Security Council authorization, such unilateral actions disproportionately endangers the global south. It states that it depends upon charter-based safeguards against power asymmetries. Okay, so today we will be discussing all these issues in a flashpoint. So the US has conducted an operation on the Venezuelan sovereign territory. It resulted in the arrest of its president, and US has framed it as law enforcement. But it is a challenge to the sovereignty. It is a test for the United Nations, and it is a concern for the global south. So it raises serious questions about the weakening credibility of international legal frameworks such as United Nations General Assemblies, United Nations Security Council authorization, and the power asymmetries. Okay, so today we will be discussing on what are the potential factors behind the US action against the Venezuela. So the first and the foremost factor is the geopolitical strategy. We famously call it as Donro Doctrine. So a primary driver is the reassertion of US dominance in the Western Hemisphere. So in the Monroe Doctrine, it says that it's an 1823 policy. The Monroe Doctrine is an 1823 policy. It opposes European or external influence in the Americas. Okay, so the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 policy, it opposes European or external influence in the America. So the recent US administration has explicitly referenced the Monroe Doctrine, and it has almost termed it as Donro Doctrine. So the US views Venezuela as close ties with Russia, China, Iran, and which is a direct threat to regional security, majorly to the Americas. For instance, if you see, China has loaned over 60 billion to Venezuela since 2007. A practice the US views as a predatory lending, which is designed to create permanent dependency. So that is the reason US wanted to counter this kind of a geopolitical strategy, and it has come up with one doctrine called as a Donro Doctrine. So that it aimed at opposing any external interference in the Americas will be kind of reprimanded. And the second reason, the potential reason for US usurpation on Venezuela is a strategy for the world's largest oil reserves. As you all know, the Venezuela sits top the world's largest proven oil reserves, which is estimated at 303 billion barrels. So, US actions are heavily influenced by the desire to secure and stabilize these energy inputs so that it can grant significant leverage over these global oil prices. It can determine the global oil prices. It can demand these global oil prices. And this is one of the biggest statement what US President Donald Trump is saying. Venezuela should return oil. Venezuela should return the land and other assets which he claimed that it had been taken from the US. So a key goal of the Donald Trump or key goal of the United States is to increase the production of the heavy sour crude that US Gulf Coast refineries are specifically designed to process so that it can lower the domestic energy costs. So to have a strategy, to have a stranglehold on resources and oil strategy, this is one of the potent weapon that US has used against Venezuela. And the third reason, the potential reason, is law enforcement. That is the war on narco-terrorism. The US has increasingly framed its actions not just as a diplomacy but as a criminal justice matter. Okay, so as you know, the Nicolas Maduro and other high-ranking officials were indicated in US federal courts on charges of narco-terrorism conspiracy. So the US alleges that the cartel of the Suns is run by Venezuelan officials itself. Okay, the officials, the Venezuelan ministers. So it has collaborated with groups like FARC so that it will flood the US with cocaine, narco and all. So to curtail this narco-terrorism, US had done this Operation Absolute Resolve. Okay. But what is the central question here? Does a law enforcement objectify, okay, on the pretext of law enforcement, does it objectify justifying the use of a military force on a sovereign territory like Venezuela? Okay, so we shall analyze this. There are two sides of the same coin. There are two arguments. One is argument in favor, which is US position, and arguments against. So what are the arguments in favor? The arguments in favor are the proponents of the US action argue that the traditional laws of war must evolve to meet modern hybrid threats that do not involve traditional armies. So the functional equivalence to an armed attack. So the first case that made by the US is, the US argues that the invasion of fentanyl and the activities of state-sponsored gangs, it causes more American deaths annually than a conventional military strike. So because of narco-terrorism. So by labeling this narco-terrorism, the administration has framed the drug flow as an attack under Article 51 of the UN Charter. It has justified it as a military response in self-defense. Okay, so this is the first and foremost case that has been made by the US. And the second case is the unwilling or unable doctrine. This theory, it posits that if a sovereign state is either unwilling to stop criminal gangs on its soil or it is actively collaborating with them, then it is their right. So that it becomes their automatical right, so that to forfeits its right to absolute sovereignty. Okay, so if any state government is not able to stop the criminal gangs on its soil, it automatically forfeits its right to absolute sovereignty. Okay, it forfeits its right to absolute sovereignty. So it allows the another state to neutralize this threat. So this is what the unwilling or unable doctrine says. Okay. And US is not invading. What is the view of the US? US is not invading a country. It is just neutralizing a threat that the local government is refusing to handle or it is unable to handle because of its weak machinery, administration, and infrastructure. So it is effectively acting as a global policeman where the local system has failed. So next, the Kerr-Frisbee doctrine. From a purely US legal perspective, the how of a capture does not matter as much as the who. Under the Kerr-Frisbee precedent, US courts has ruled that even if a defendant is brought to the US through a military force, the court still has the authority to try them. This creates a powerful domestic incentive to use force to bypass slow or blocked extradition processes. Okay? So this is what the Kerr-Frisbee doctrine says. But there are some cases against unilateral action by the US. So what is the case against? What are the arguments against? Critics argue that the action is a dangerous precedent. It can destroy the global order. It can destroy the territorial sovereignty. It can create a law of the jungle. So it's no more a law of a civilized world. It's no more a law of a global order. It is a law of one nation. So it's a law of jungle. So it violates. So the operation is a clear breach of violation of Article 2, Clause 4. So what is it is the bedrock principle of international law. What it says, use of a force against the territorial integrity of any state. So US has violated this article, Clause 2, Clause 4 of the UN Charter. So using of force against the territorial state like Venezuela, it is something creating law of jungles, where the strongest nations act without any kind of restraint. It is acting without responsibility. Okay? And the second principle, what the case against, is lack of a kinetic threshold. International law defines an armed attack as a physical military strike. The critics argue that rebranding drug flows such as is legal gymnastics to justify a regime change mission. So by doing so, the definitions of words to justify an operation in reality is a regime change mission. Okay, so the doing of operations or justifying an operations in reality is a regime change mission. Next, the evasion of International Criminal Court. So the opponents argue that if the US were truly interested in justice and human rights, it would have supported the ICC's existing investigations into Venezuela, right? Rather than launching a unilateral raid. So by capturing a head of state for trial in New York court, the US is seen as prioritizing its own political interests and narcotic laws over the established international framework for prosecuting the mass atrocities. So this is how the US is kind of evading the International Criminal Court. Okay, so you should follow. If it is really interested, then it would have supported the investigations that are made in the Venezuela, but only to further its own political interests and to curb or curtail the narcotic laws. It has even breached the international framework for prosecuting mass atrocities. This is not a good global order what we are talking about. So as UN Secretary General has mentioned, it is a dangerous precedent that destroys the global order. Okay? So even there is a concern from the global south nations like Brazil, South Africa, India, Philippines and all. So this kind of a precedent, it disproportionately endangers states that rely on UN Charter based safeguards to protect them from power asymmetries. Even it is an impact on multilateralism. India is a big advocate of territorial sovereignty, and as you know, India is also having a greater voice in UN Security Council. But these kind of unilateral actions by the powerful nations, it reduces the credibility of UNSC, UNGA kind of nations. So it will reduce the impact on multilateralism. So more and more the countries will go for bilateralism, trilateralism and plurilateralism rather than multilateralism, which reduces the global order. Okay, it creates the law of jungle. So even they does not have any kind of incentive, these global south nations, they does not have any kind of incentives to remain in multilateralism, and they does not want to reform this, and this institution will be kind of redundant. Okay, so yeah, these are some of the critical questions for a new era and for your examination also. How can international law adapt to hybrid threats like narco terrorism without its core principles becoming meaningless? Will this even accelerate a global shift away from a US led order to a more multiple world? And not la- but last but not the least question, which is kind of a burning topic from the last 10 years, 20 years. What is the future of UN Security Council authority in an era of renewed great power competition from nations with different access: China, Russia, US, India, Brazil? So what is in this great power competition, and European Union obviously? So what is the power future of UNSC's authority? So these are some of the questions that you need to ponder, and you can write and you can prepare for your examination, and you should think how, in which direction the global order is heading towards. Thank you. We will meet in the next session.